Welcome back to Drive Your Thoughts podcast. I'm your host, Master Coach Carrie Marshall, and it's time to go after those goals.
Yeah, whether ready or not, life's coming hard, no breaks, no stop. And if you put me on the spot, don't get it twisted, I never drop. If you feel a bit out of control and out the box, here's a way that you could drive your thoughts. Turn this podcast on, it's a lock. Carrie Marshall on the clock.
Hey everyone, I'm so excited to be here with you today. I want to talk to you about when your buffers start to become habits. So let's kind of start off by defining a buffer, because I know for some of you, you're new to the podcast. So a buffer is any activity that you're doing to actually not have to feel your feelings. So let's take stress, for example. Stress is one that a lot of us feel, stress and anxiety. And so oftentimes what happens is you'll be feeling stressed, thinking about maybe the things that you need to do that day, or maybe you did have a hard day. There's stressful things going on in your life. And so then what you'll do, instead of going and actually processing the stress and like actually diving in to see what's happening, what we do is then we'll go out and do an activity. Maybe it's overeating, maybe it's Netflixing, maybe it's smoking a joint or being on your phone. Those would all be considered in that moment a buffer. Now, notice that when I talked about buffers, all of those things that I mentioned can have kind of a negative connotation depending on who you are, right? But just so you know, any activity can be used as a buffer. I once had a client that was really, and I think I've talked about him before, he was really physically fit, but he was actually using the gym as a buffer. You know, he was having stress about his marriage, and him and his wife would kind of get into an argument or whatever, and then he'd go to the gym. It wasn't scheduled. He probably had already been to the gym that day, but he actually would end up going to the gym. And so that ended up kind of being a buffer in that circumstance. So what I want you to know about buffers is, number one, buffers are anything that we're going to do when we don't want to feel a feeling or process through what's happening in our lives. And number two, a buffer really can be any activity. For me, buffering can really be reading. I've talked about this before. I love to read books, but I do know that when it's not scheduled and I'm trying to avoid something, sometimes I'll just get into a really good fiction book and I will be gone to the world until that book is gone. That's a buffer, right? We're going to an activity instead of actually managing our emotions and going into our emotions. So one thing that you need to know is that we all have buffers. There's never going to be a time where you're completely not going to be buffering. But what I see happen with a lot of people is they start to take a buffer for one thing or another, and then it becomes a habit. So one of my clients came to me and he was smoking a lot of weed. And he said, I don't have a problem with weed. It's the amount of weed that I'm smoking. And he said it went from recreational to then I was seeing that I was doing it every time I was stressed or anxious or even was kind of leaning towards that. So he said it definitely became a buffer. And then he said it went from then being a buffer to a habit, meaning that then we get in the process of just doing it, and we're doing it so much that now we've created a habit of the buffer. So that's one example. Here's one that is actually maybe closer to home for you. Have you ever found yourself maybe scrolling on your phone too much, right? You get stressed and anxious and you just need to check out for a minute. And so then you're, going to get on your phone and maybe scroll through social media a little bit. Well, then 10 minutes later, you're still scrolling. That could be a buffer, but then notice when it turns into a habit. We don't just do it now when we're stressed and anxious. We're doing it when we're at a red light in the car, or we're doing it when we're making dinner and we're just waiting for the water to boil, or our kids are talking to us and we just start to mindlessly scroll. It's not that we are buffering from listening to our kids. It's that it's become a habit. So when we see that these habits are starting to form from these buffers, there's a couple of different things that I always like to tell my clients that we need to do. Number one, first is just being honest with yourself. We've got to start to just be honest with ourselves about what the activity is and how much of our time it's consuming. So I love that some of our phones track how much consumption we're doing on social media platforms. I actually think that that's a really good wake up call for a lot of us. Now, I know that some of you are out there and you're probably not looking at that. Maybe you're avoiding it because you really don't want to see, but we want to be truthful to ourselves. Being honest with yourself is one of the bestest gifts that you can give yourself because you don't need to bring the shame with honesty. You can be honest and still like yourself and not have to beat yourself up. So back to that reading my book, when I actually sat down once and just said, like, I'm reading a lot, I could look at it and say, I should have been doing this and this and this. Or I could have just said, like, let me go back and actually look at the time spent reading for the past 2 weeks. And when I looked at that, the number was like 12 hours for each week. So like 24 hours of reading books. And so I had to kind of just look at that. Now I could go into shame and tell myself a story about how I shouldn't have and how I wasted 24 hours. Or I could just look at it and say, honestly, I spent 24 hours reading fiction. Okay. Now what do I want to think about it? Well, my thought, instead of beating myself up, was like, what I want to do is spend my time differently. It wasn't, I spent my time wrong. Notice the difference? I just want to spend my time differently. So when we're thinking about our buffers and making them habits and maybe seeing that the habit is getting a little bit out of hand, first, let's identify why it's getting out of hand. So I went back to my client that was smoking the weed and I was like, so why is this a problem for you? And first off, he goes, I think you're the first person to like not want to like try and get me into like a system or anything like that. I'm like, well, I just need to know from your perspective, honestly, why is this a problem? And so then he was kind of listing out like, well, I've had a couple of work projects due and I've missed the deadline. I'm not connecting with my wife like I would like to. And so he kind of had these reasons of why the smoking weed had gotten out of hand. Same thing with my client that was buffering with her phone. I was like, okay, so why is this a problem? Same type of thing. She's like, yeah, I can just see that now I'm just kind of mindlessly scrolling a lot. Like it's getting out of hand. So I really want to come back to being able to have the phone and be able to make choices that I either want to be on it or don't. But this whole mindlessly scrolling just isn't working for me anymore. So first, I want you to identify what habit it is that maybe isn't serving you to the best that you want right now. Maybe you're getting in the pattern of binge watching Netflix too much. And so it wasn't just that one show, but now we're on like show 4 of binging. And you're noticing that you're like not going out with friends on the weekend, or, you have stopped getting yourself ready. That's what we're kind of looking at when we talk about a buffer going into a habit. So the first thing, like I said, is being able to acknowledge where you're actually at and be honest with yourself. The second thing that I want you to know is that if you're willing and you want to kind of cut back on this habit and start to then have choices around it a little bit more, the second thing that I want to notice is I want you to really think about taking that habit and doing it in one place only. So often when we start to do habits, what happens is we start to do the habit in a lot of different areas in our life. So for instance, if we're talking about maybe watching Netflix, it goes from like watching Netflix in the front room to like, oh, I watched Netflix in the front room and downstairs, and then I got the app on my phone. So now I'm watching it at work as well. So this can happen a lot. And so what we want to do is we want to isolate the activity to one spot. So for instance, if you're really scrolling on social media, I'm not going to tell you to stop cold turkey right now, because that usually doesn't work for people. But what I want you to do is I want you to just find your spot that you can isolate it. So maybe you're going to scroll on social media in your car only, meaning that maybe it's in a parking lot, or maybe you're in your house and then you're wanting to scroll, but you have to actually take yourself and isolate the activity to one spot only. that really does help us to just kind of become a little bit more aware because we can't do the activity all the time, all over the place. So if you can isolate the activity, that can help. The second thing that we're going to do, or the third thing actually, is we want to make sure that as we're going to isolate the activity, once again, we're going to go back to telling the truth. So if you're going to scroll on social media and you're on your way out to the car, you just have to stop at the door and tell yourself, like, okay, the reason I'm going to scroll on social media is because I really don't want to listen to my kids fight. I'd much rather just like tap out, zone out, and go and scroll on social media. There's so much power with actually starting to identify why we're doing the habit or the buffer. So for my client that was smoking weed, he had like this one piece of wood that he would go and sit on in the backyard. So instead of like smoking weed in his house and here in the car and all these places, he was like, it has to be in my backyard on this log. He's like, I have to go and sit on the log. I'm like, okay, so what we want to do is now identify why you're going out to the log. So tell yourself, and I told him, you can smoke as many times as you want during the day at first. He's like, okay, that's gonna be helpful. He's like, I really thought that once again, you're gonna tell me like, I need to get on a plan and I need to do this. I'm like, no. What we want to do is tell the truth about how much it's going on, isolate the activity to one certain spot, and then third, tell the truth on the way out to the isolated area. Why am I on my way out to that area? Why do I need the joint? Why do I need a scroll? When we get in a pattern of doing something, habits like to become just autopilot. Our brains love to put things on autopilot because it actually feels like it's conserving energy. And so that's why habits actually form, is because our brain loves to have things on habits. And our brain doesn't care if it's a good habit or a bad habit. It will put viewing pornography on that, like, let's just do it habit list, just like it will you brushing your teeth. And so just to be able to identify how that thing is actually helping or hurting you is going to be really beneficial. I actually like to have my clients go through their habit list and just kind of actually put a mark. Is this good or bad for me? It's super simple. You can just go through and say, okay, scrolling on social media, good or bad? Now your brain's going to want to kind of fight for it because it's like, no, don't take it off the habit list. The habit list is helpful because we could just do it and we don't have to think about it. But your habits really are the things that are building blocks towards your success and what's happening in your life. And so if you have a habit, for instance, of scrolling on social media, and then you notice how it's impacting your life, maybe you're going to say like, yeah, this actually doesn't really combine with like what I'm really wanting for my life. So for instance, when I was talking to my client about scrolling on her social media, she kind of wanted to fight for it a little bit. She was like, but I have a business and I need to engage with people and I need to do this. And I'm like, yeah, but is that really true? Come to find out, she actually has a social media manager that posts and engages for her. And so that really, even the story that she was telling herself wasn't really true. So identify your habits. Really ask yourself honestly, how much time am I spending? Now, this could be time spent actually doing the activity, but it could also be time spent consumed thinking about the activity. I do watch some of my clients get really invested. Like for instance, my client that was working out a lot at the gym, he had isolated the activity, but what he hadn't done is he hadn't have gone back and actually looked at how much time he was spending in the gym and how much time he was thinking about going to the gym. And that's really where he was kind of letting things get out of hand, is he was like, I'd be talking to my wife and totally go blank, not listening to her at all. Because I was like, okay, when am I going to go? How much parking is going to be available? What's my set going to look like? Did I do legs already today? Like if I did legs already, then what? So he was getting really, really kind of involved with his thoughts about the gym. So we all have these buffers, like I mentioned, we kind of use buffers to kind of go through and help us so that we don't have to think about our stress or anxiety or those emotions that don't feel really good. Stop numbing out from your life. I promise you that even though you don't think you can, your body is actually made to process all emotion. It's just that you don't have practice doing it. And so you want to start to practice processing your emotion. We are made to feel emotion in our life, and we're not just made to feel happiness and excitement. We are actually made to feel the whole entire process of emotions. That entire section of emotions, you are actually made to feel. So if you're not good at feeling stress, start by just telling yourself that you're going to feel a little bit of it. It's another thing that you can do is if you know that you're going to go out and smoke the joint, okay, go smoke the joint, but give yourself time to actually feel a little bit anxious for a minute. Tell yourself, like, where does that feel anxious? Oh, I feel it in my stomach. Oh, now my leg's bouncing up and down. Okay, what am I going to tell myself about this anxiety? Identify it, notice where you're feeling it in your body, and then if you need to go tap out, like tap out. That's fine. You're learning, though, how to process your emotion. This is one of those skills that we talk about of being an emotional adult. You can be an adult physically and you can be a child emotionally. And so what we're wanting to do is we're wanting to have an emotionally adult because then you can actually start to identify and process your emotion in a helpful way. So identify those habits, be honest with yourself, isolate the incident, the activity to one area, and then once again, be honest with yourself about why you need that activity. This is really going to help for some of you that are in those bad habit cycles. Come on over to Drive Your Thoughts Coaching on Instagram or on YouTube, and let's continue this conversation. We'll see you next time. Bye. Thanks for listening to this podcast episode. If you're ready to get in the driver's seat of your own life, you can come and follow me at Drive Your Thoughts Coaching on Instagram, or come and see more ways to work with me at driveyourthoughts.com.
Yeah, whether ready or not, life's coming hard, no breaks, no stop. And if you put me on the spot, don't get it twisted, I never drop. If you feel a bit out of control and out the box, here's a way that you could drive your thoughts. Turn this podcast on, it's a lock. Carrie Marshall on the clock.